Welcome to this first screencast for Chapter 4, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Community Ecology. In this week's screencast, we'll look at the processes of evolution and extinction, and we'll look at how those processes underlie biodiversity, and we'll also look at community ecology, which is the relationship between organisms, between populations within a community. The chapter begins with a case study regarding what was known then as the Spanish flu, or the flu of 1918, which occurred between the years 1918 and 1920. The Spanish flu was a pandemic, so it was a global epidemic. It was spread all over the world, killing 20 million people worldwide. And among U.S. citizenry, it killed 600,000 U.S. citizens. Some of them were in the U.S. at the time, and others were serving overseas in World War I. So a couple of things I want to say about this case study. This flu was caused by a virus that's very similar. It's an H1N1 virus, very similar to some others that have been around in recent times. And it was named the Spanish flu not because it actually originated in Spain. At the time, how do I put this? Okay, it originated in the United States most likely, and particularly at a particular military base where troops were being trained for overseas. The U.S. press was not permitted to write about this pandemic. The Spanish press was able to write about it, and therefore it became known as the Spanish flu because they were the only ones reporting on it, not because they were the only one experiencing this serious viral pandemic. So, to make a longer story shorter, it was discovered back in the 1918 period in China that there was a plant that possessed antiviral properties, and that plant is shown here. Even though it looks like it has pretty yellow little flowers, it was known as the dung of the devil because it was quite stinky. Its sap and its roots are quite stinky. But it did have antiviral properties, or it seemed to help treat the Spanish flu. And back later, when SARS started spreading around, the Chinese scientists looked at this plant to see whether they could also establish what it was in that plant that possessed the antiviral properties, and could that be used to treat current viruses. And the point here is that this is often the case. We find that many medicinal properties are found in nature, in living things, and very little of it at this point has actually been isolated and tested. Some of the well-known examples, one is that aspirin, salicylic acid, was originally taken from certain willow trees. But there are probably many other plants in particular, but organisms in general. Could it be insects? It could be anything that have medicinal properties. And when we deforest and when we cause extinctions, then it also does directly affect humans because we're not able to find these organisms with these properties. Okay, so let's move ahead now. So we're going to look at biodiversity and why it's important beyond just the reason of having beneficial medicinal properties. Biodiversity is vital to sustaining life on Earth, and the biodiversity needs to exist on all three levels. There needs to be a variety of genes within a particular species. There needs to be a variety of species within a particular ecosystem, and there needs to be a variety of ecosystems and processes around the globe. And the more biodiversity we have, the more organisms and ecosystems can withstand changes and life can continue. So evolution is the mechanism which underlies biodiversity. And so we'll talk a lot about genes and how that leads to different species developing over long periods of time. And last, we'll look at how humans are affecting biodiversity. Okay, so let's look again at the variety at the three different levels. Here we have some chipmunks, and the variety of genes within the chipmunks are shown here by having them in different colors, red, green, and blue, showing that the three chipmunks are not identical. Of course, they are very similar, but not identical. And typically, within genetic diversity, it's particularly important when a disease comes through. You may have some individuals that have an ability to withstand that disease and survive, and then they'll pass that on to their offspring. It's also important when you have a physical change, like a change in climate, or a hurricane, or some other type of force such as that. The more diversity you have, the more organisms will be able to withstand it. The second level of diversity is species diversity, which is shown here. That chipmunk is now in a forest with some wildflowers, some mosses, some fungi, some mushrooms, and some tall trees, and a bigger animal here in terms of the bear. And so the more diversity within the more species diversity within a particular ecosystem, the healthier that ecosystem will be. Looking at the third level, ecosystem diversity throughout the globe, we have here the example of California, where we have the ocean, and then the intertidal zone, sand, and then some low growth. And then as you move up the mountains and the temperatures are colder, the type of vegetation changes, and the amount of precipitation comes down on this side of the mountain, drawing that water right up here, and then reaching the peak of the mountains. Let's say that's the Sierra Nevada, where they might have snow at the peak, and then the downside, or the continental side of the mountain area, would be much drier, leading here to a desert. So this is one example that shows where you can have a great deal of ecosystem diversity, even within a narrow geographic range. Okay, next we're going to look at species biodiversity. And we used the example of the chipmunk on the previous slide, but let's go back and define what a species is. A species is a set of individuals that can mate and produce fertile offspring in nature. So a set of individuals that in nature will mate together and produce offspring that are also fertile, which means they can produce offspring. Okay, so again, in nature is really an important part of this, and also the fertile offspring is an important part of this. There are examples of things that don't really happen in nature but do in captivity. For example, there's the liger, which is a male lion and a female tiger. But the offspring is not fertile, and again, it doesn't happen in nature. Another example is a mule, which is has a male donkey as one parent and a female horse as the other. And again, it is not fertile, so a mule cannot have baby mules. So 2 million species have been identified worldwide, 50% of those living in endangered tropical rainforest. And it's thought there are actually probably closer to 10 million species. So another 8 million that maybe haven't been identified as yet, and risk never being identified. An important category of species are the insects, and they're important for a number of reasons, but one of those, as you might understand already, is pollinating our producers. Okay, so Earth's life does change over time, and it changes significantly naturally, and it can change significantly due to human activity. So the life forms on Earth change over time, great periods of time typically, and that biodiversity is driven by evolution, changes in the genes of an organism, such that the resultant organism is better suited to a current environment. So let's look first at some definitions of how that works. Evolution is defined as how the genetic composition of a species changes over time. And genes are the physical locations on chromosomes that code for inherited traits. So let's take it down a level. You have a cell, whether it's a single cellular organism or a multicellular organism. They're composed of cells. Within those cells, there are chromosomes, which are double-stranded. A human would have 23 sets of them, for example. And on those chromosomes within those cells are pieces of coding known as genes that tell the cell or direct the cell to direct it to activities such as protein production. So genes are specific chemical compounds that contain the genetic instructions needed for a cell to grow and develop and maintain all of its activities. And each chromosome can contain hundreds to thousands of genes. Now, to give you some idea of the scale that we're talking about, it turns out that a simple bacteria, such as E. coli, has about 4,000 genes. And a little worm, which normally has about 1,000 cells, would have 19,000 genes. So it was thought that the human genome would have maybe 100,000 genes because we're much more complex organisms. As it turns out, as a result of studying genes in the Human Genome Project, we have at most about 30,000 genes, and some estimates, as they're working on what exactly is a gene, are that it might even be lower than that. It could be as low as 20,000 genes. And they're finding it's really much more complex, that there are types of RNA that were previously unknown to have a function that may be doing a lot of the directing. So, but the basic underlying dogma, the central dogma, was that DNA codes for messenger RNA, which codes for protein. So the DNA was directing the cellular functions, but that picture is now evolved. Anyway, that's more than you need to worry about right now. A mutation, we'll wrap up on that. A mutation is when there's a random change in that genetic code. So the chemical compound changes in some way, and that change is usually disadvantageous for an organism. It can be advantageous for an organism, which we will look at, but only if that mutation takes place in a reproductive cell will it be passed on to offspring. So your body is composed, or all bodies, multicellular bodies, are composed of two types of cells: somatic cells, which would be cells like in your skin or your kidneys or whatever, and reproductive cells, which would be things like sperm and egg. And if a mutation occurs in a somatic cell, that's only going to affect that individual organism. But if the mutation occurs in a reproductive cell, then it would be passed on to the offspring, for better or for worse. All right, let's wrap that up here.